The roar of a powerful motorcycle echoed through the quiet streets of a suburban neighborhood, breaking the peaceful morning silence. It was the kind of sound that made people peek out of their windows, wondering what kind of trouble might be rolling into their otherwise calm lives. This particular trouble came in the form of a young man, clad in a leather jacket with a smug grin plastered across his face, speeding recklessly on his shiny black bike. His name was Jackson, and he wasn't the kind of person who cared much about rules or about anyone else's feelings, for that matter. Jackson loved being the center of attention. He reveled in the way his bike's thunderous engine turned heads and how his stunts left people either gasping in awe or shaking their heads in disapproval. For him, it was all part of the fun, pushing boundaries, stirring reactions, and living life as though he were invincible. But what Jackson loved most was the thrill of power, the sense of control that came from knowing he could do whatever he wanted without facing any real consequences. At least, that's what he thought. On this particular morning, Jackson was in an unusually cocky mood. The sun was shining, the road was clear, and he was eager to find some new way to entertain himself. As he turned a sharp corner, something caught his eye. A small dog trotting happily along the sidewalk, its tail wagging with innocent joy. The dog was a golden retriever, young and full of life, its fur shimmering in the sunlight. It was the kind of sight that would warm most people's hearts, but for Jackson, it sparked a completely different reaction. With a twisted sense of amusement, Jackson revved his engine and swerved closer to the sidewalk. The dog froze for a moment, startled by the sudden noise, its head tilting in confusion. And then, in a split second of thoughtless cruelty, Jackson extended his foot and delivered a sharp kick to the unsuspecting animal. The dog yelped in pain, stumbling to the ground, its joyful energy replaced by fear and confusion. A few bystanders gasped, their hands flying to their mouths in shock. One elderly woman shouted, "What's wrong with you?" But Jackson simply laughed, his voice full of mockery. He sped off without a second glance, leaving a trail of dust and a stunned crowd behind him. What Jackson didn't realize, however, was that his little act of fun was far from harmless. The golden retriever wasn't just any dog. It belonged to someone who had a reputation for being fiercely protective of the ones he cared about. And this someone wasn't just anyone. This was a man whose quiet demeanor and kind spirit masked a steely resolve, someone who had faced much tougher challenges in life than a cocky biker on a power trip. This was Keanu Reeves. Keanu, who had been watching from a distance, had seen everything. He wasn't dressed like the movie star most people recognized. In his casual jeans and a simple black t-shirt, he blended in effortlessly with the neighborhood. But there was no mistaking the sharp intensity in his eyes as he hurried to his dog's side, his heart pounding with a mix of concern and anger. The golden retriever, which Keanu had named Charlie, was more than just a pet to him. Charlie was family, a loyal companion who had been with him through thick and thin. Kneeling down, Keanu gently ran his hands over Charlie, checking for injuries. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered, his voice calm and soothing despite the storm brewing inside him. Charlie licked his hand weakly, his tail giving a small wag as if to say, "I'll be fine." But Keanu wasn't fine. His mind raced as he replayed the scene in his head, the biker's smug grin, the sound of Charlie's painful yelp, and the calloused laughter that followed. He knew he couldn't let this slide, not because he was Keanu Reeves, the celebrity, but because he was a man who believed in standing up for what was right, especially when it came to protecting the innocent. For a moment, he stood still, his eyes narrowing as he watched the trail of dust left by the biker fade into the distance. He didn't know who this guy was or why he thought it was okay to hurt an innocent animal, but one thing was certain: Jackson had messed with the wrong dog. Keanu's calm exterior concealed a determination that burned like fire. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. It was about showing people like Jackson that their actions had consequences. That cruelty wasn't something you could just walk or ride away from. As Keanu picked up Charlie and carried him toward his car, He couldn't help but wonder if this biker had any idea what he had just set into motion. Probably not, but he would soon find out. Keanu placed Charlie gently on the passenger seat of his car, his hands steady despite the simmering anger inside him. The dog looked up at him with trusting eyes, as if he knew Keanu would make everything right. "You'll be okay, buddy," Keanu murmured again, his voice soft but resolute. He pulled out his phone, snapped a picture of Charlie to document his condition, and then took a deep breath. This wasn't just about Charlie anymore. It was about sending a message, one that Jackson would not forget anytime soon. As Keanu started the car, memories of his life with Charlie flashed through his mind. He had rescued the golden retriever from a shelter 2 years ago, during a time when his own life had been marked by quiet solitude. Charlie had brought light into his world, filling the empty spaces with unconditional love and joy. The bond they shared wasn't something Keanu took lightly. Seeing Charlie hurt like this was a line crossed, a personal violation that he couldn't ignore. He drove to the nearest veterinary clinic, his focus unwavering. The streets seemed quieter now, almost as if the world had taken a collective pause after the chaos Jackson had unleashed. Keanu didn't notice the stares from passers-by who might have recognized him. He didn't care. His priority was Charlie, and the thought of holding the biker accountable simmered in the back of his mind, waiting for its moment. At the clinic, the veterinarian examined Charlie carefully. "He's shaken, but fortunately there's no serious injury," the vet said with a reassuring smile. "He'll need rest and some TLC for the next few days." Keanu felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it didn't dull the edge of his determination. He thanked the vet, paid the bill, and carried Charlie back to the car. As he drove home, his mind raced with thoughts about Jackson. Who was this guy? Why did he think it was acceptable to hurt an innocent animal for fun? Keanu knew that trying to reason with someone like that might not get far. People who acted out of arrogance and cruelty often needed more than words to understand the consequences of their actions. Once home, Keanu settled Charlie on a soft blanket in the living room and sat beside him, stroking his fur. The rhythmic motion helped calm his thoughts as he pieced together a plan. He couldn't let Jackson get away with this, not just for Charlie's sake, but for every person or animal who might cross paths with someone like him in the future. Keanu reached for his laptop, his fingers moving quickly as he pulled up local news websites and community forums. He was looking for any mention of reckless bikers or incidents involving motorcycles in the area. It didn't take long before he stumbled upon a thread on a neighborhood forum titled "Dangerous Biker on the Loose." The thread was filled with complaints from residents describing a young man on a black bike who had been speeding through the streets, ignoring traffic laws, and pulling stunts that left pedestrians shaken. One comment caught Keanu's attention. "This guy almost hit me while I was walking my dog last week. He doesn't care about anyone. Someone needs to stop him before something worse happens." Another comment mentioned the bikers' hangout, a small garage on the outskirts of town where local riders often gathered. Keanu's jaw tightened. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Keanu prepared to head out. He wasn't entirely sure what he was going to do yet, but he knew he needed to see this biker in person. Not as some Hollywood star looking for attention, but as a man standing up for what was right. He grabbed his jacket and keys, glancing back at Charlie one last time. "Stay here, buddy. I'll be back soon." The drive to the garage was uneventful, but the tension in Keanu's chest grew with each passing mile. The air seemed thicker, the night darker, as if the world itself was holding its breath. When he arrived, he parked his car a safe distance away and approached on foot, blending into the shadows. The garage was lit with a dim, flickering light, and the sound of laughter and revving engines filled the air. Keanu spotted the black bike immediately. It was parked near the entrance, its glossy paint catching the light like a trophy. A group of bikers stood nearby, talking loudly and sharing stories of their latest antics. Among them was Jackson, his leather jacket slung casually over his shoulder, his posture oozing arrogance. Keanu observed quietly, his calm demeanor masking the storm within. He could see now that Jackson thrived on attention. His exaggerated gestures and loud laughter were designed to keep the group's focus on him, to solidify his role as the leader. It was a game of dominance, and Jackson was playing it to perfection. Keanu stepped closer, his movements quiet and deliberate. He wasn't ready to confront Jackson just yet. First, he needed to understand the dynamics of the group, to figure out how to make his message resonate not just with Jackson, but with everyone watching. As he stood in the shadows, listening to their conversation, he learned more about Jackson's mindset. The young biker bragged about his reckless stunts, twisting every story to make himself the hero. There was no mention of the dog, no hint of remorse. To Jackson, it had been just another fleeting moment in a day filled with self-indulgent thrills. Keanu's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain composed. He wasn't here to lose control or let anger dictate his actions. He was here to show Jackson, and anyone else who might be watching, that real strength came from standing up for what was right, not from tearing others down. After a while, Jackson broke away from the group and walked toward his bike, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it with a casual flick of his wrist. Keanu saw his chance. He stepped out of the shadows, his presence sudden but not aggressive. Jackson looked up, startled for a moment, before his expression shifted into one of smug curiosity. "Can I help you?" Jackson asked, his tone laced with mockery. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He let the silence linger, his steady gaze locked on Jackson. The other bikers noticed the exchange and began to quiet down, their curiosity piqued. "I saw what you did this morning," Keanu finally said, his voice calm but firm. "To the dog." Jackson smirked, exhaling a puff of smoke. "And what about it? Just a mutt, not a big deal." Keanu's eyes narrowed, his calm exterior hiding the anger bubbling beneath the surface. He took a step closer, his voice low but unwavering. "It is a big deal, and you know it." The weight of Keanu's words hung in the air, silencing the laughter and chatter around them. The other bikers exchanged glances, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Jackson's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. He straightened up, his arrogance returning as he tried to reassert control. "Look, old man," Jackson said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're way out of your league here." Keanu took another step forward, his calm presence becoming even more commanding. "You don't know who I am," he said simply, "but you're about to find out." The group fell completely silent, the tension thick in the air. For the first time, Jackson looked genuinely uncertain, his bravado cracking under the weight of Keanu's steady gaze. Jackson took a slow drag of his cigarette, his hands steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who stood so calmly in the face of confrontation. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, their attention glued to the unfolding standoff. For years, Jackson had dominated this circle with his loud personality and reckless attitude, but now, with one quiet man standing before him, the dynamic felt different. Keanu didn't move closer, but his presence seemed to fill the space between them. He wasn't intimidating in the traditional sense, yet there was something in his posture, in the way he carried himself, that made Jackson hesitate. He tossed his cigarette to the ground, grinding it under his boot as if to assert some kind of dominance. "All right, old man," he said with a forced laugh. "If you've got something to say, say it. Otherwise, walk away before you get hurt." Keanu's gaze remained steady. He wasn't here to trade insults or escalate the situation into something physical. His goal was to hold Jackson accountable, to make him understand that cruelty, even to a dog, had real consequences. "I'm not going anywhere," Keanu said evenly. "Not until you understand what you've done." Jackson laughed again, but it didn't have the same confidence as before. "What I've done," he repeated mockingly. "You're acting like I kicked a person. It was just a dog. Get over it." Keanu's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm. "That just a dog is my family. He didn't deserve what you did to him, and neither does anyone else you've hurt with your recklessness." The other bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Keanu's words had hit a nerve, not just with Jackson, but with the group as a whole. They knew Jackson's behavior often went too far, but they had never spoken up, afraid of losing their place in the hierarchy. Now, with an outsider challenging him, they found themselves questioning their silence. One of the younger bikers, a wiry teenager named Ryan, cleared his throat. "Jackson," he said hesitantly, "maybe you should apologize. I mean, if it's his dog." Jackson turned sharply toward Ryan, his glare silencing the boy immediately. "You don't tell me what to do," he snapped. "Stay out of it." Keanu's eyes flicked to Ryan for a brief moment, noting the fear and uncertainty in his expression. It was clear that Jackson's dominance wasn't built on respect, but on intimidation. Keanu felt a pang of pity for the younger biker. He had probably joined this group searching for belonging, only to find himself trapped under Jackson's thumb. Turning his attention back to Jackson, Keanu decided to push further. "You act like you're in control," he said, his voice steady. "But real control isn't about hurting others or making them afraid of you. It's about taking responsibility for your actions." Jackson's face darkened, his bravado giving way to anger. "You don't know anything about me," he said through gritted teeth. "You think you can walk in here and lecture me? You're nobody." Keanu allowed the insult to hang in the air, unbothered. He knew Jackson was grasping for control, trying to maintain the upper hand in a situation that was slipping away from him. But Keanu also knew that actions spoke louder than words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, opening the photo of Charlie lying injured after the kick. He held it up for everyone to see. "This is what you did," Keanu said quietly, but his voice carried weight. "Look at him. He trusted people, loved people, and you took that from him for no reason." The bikers leaned in, their faces registering a mix of shock and guilt as they saw the picture. Even Jackson hesitated, his eyes darting to the screen before quickly looking away. "It's just a picture," he muttered defensively. "You're blowing this way out of proportion." Keanu didn't waver. "This isn't about a picture. It's about the kind of person you want to be. Do you want to be the guy people remember for hurting others? For making the world a little worse every time you get on that bike?" Jackson's fists clenched, his knuckles white against his leather gloves. He'd opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, the garage door creaked open, and an older man stepped inside. The group turned to see Marcus, the owner of the garage and a respected figure among the local bikers. He was a tall, imposing man with a graying beard and a no-nonsense demeanor. "What's going on here?" Marcus asked, his deep voice cutting through the tension. His eyes swept over the group, landing on Keanu and then on Jackson. "Why is everyone standing around like they're at a funeral?" Jackson immediately straightened, his posture stiffening as if he were a soldier caught slacking by his commanding officer. "Nothing, Marcus," he said quickly. "Just handling some business." Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. His gaze shifted to Keanu, who met his eyes with quiet confidence. "You're not one of ours," Marcus said. "What brings you here?" Keanu stepped forward, his movements calm and deliberate. "I came to talk to him," he said, nodding toward Jackson. "He hurt my dog this morning. I want him to understand the damage he's done." Marcus's expression darkened as he looked at Jackson. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Jackson stammered, his earlier confidence crumbling under Marcus's scrutiny. "It was. I didn't mean. It was just a stupid mistake," he finally managed, his words tumbling over each other. Marcus sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "Jackson, I've given you a lot of chances, but this is too far." He turned back to Keanu. "I'm sorry about your dog. He didn't deserve that, and neither did you." Keanu nodded, appreciating the sincerity in Marcus's tone. "Thank you," he said. "But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again." Marcus nodded in agreement. "You're right." He turned to Jackson, his eyes hard. "You're going to make this right, starting now." Jackson's face turned red, a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "What do you mean?" he demanded. "I said it was a mistake. And now you're going to take responsibility for it," Marcus said firmly. "You'll apologize to him and do whatever it takes to make amends, or you can find another place to hang out." The garage fell silent again, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavy in the air. Jackson looked around, searching for support from the other bikers, but their expressions were unreadable. He was alone in this. Keanu watched the scene unfold, his heart still heavy but hopeful that perhaps, just perhaps, Jackson could learn something from this moment. Jackson stood frozen, his jaw tight, and his fists clenched at his sides. The weight of Marcus's ultimatum hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. His gaze darted from Marcus to Keanu and back to the silent crowd of bikers. None of them came to his defense. The tough, rebellious image he had so carefully cultivated now felt paper-thin, stripped away in the face of real accountability. For a moment, Jackson considered walking out, leaving behind the group that suddenly felt more like a liability than a support system. But where would he go? This garage, this group, it was all he had. He turned his glare toward Keanu, his ego burning, and his voice came out sharp and defiant. "Fine, I'll apologize. But let's not act like I'm the bad guy here. It was a stupid mistake, not a crime." Keanu's calm, unwavering expression didn't change. He had dealt with people like Jackson before, those who lashed out to mask their insecurities. But even in Jackson's defensive tone, Keanu caught a hint of vulnerability, a crack in the facade. "An apology isn't about admitting weakness," Keanu said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "It's about having the strength to recognize when you've done wrong and the courage to make it right." The room was so quiet that even the faint hum of distant traffic felt loud. Jackson's face flushed, his internal struggle playing out for everyone to see. He muttered something under his breath, barely audible. "What was that?" Marcus asked, his tone leaving no room for ambiguity. Jackson exhaled sharply, frustration spilling out in his words. "I'm sorry, all right. I'm sorry for kicking your dog." He looked at Keanu briefly before his gaze fell to the floor. "It was stupid. I wasn't thinking." The words felt forced, mechanical, but Keanu didn't expect instant sincerity. He knew that change wasn't something that happened overnight. Still, he wasn't ready to let Jackson off the hook just yet. "It's a start," Keanu said, his voice even. "But actions speak louder than words. If you mean it, prove it." Jackson's head snapped up, his expression twisting with irritation. "What do you want from me?" he snapped. "I already said I'm sorry." Keanu held his gaze, unflinching. "I want you to think about why you did it. Why hurting something weaker than you felt like the right thing to do in that moment?" The question hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. Jackson opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, his words faltering. He hadn't expected this confrontation to go so deep. His actions had always been impulsive, fueled by a need to assert his dominance, to feel powerful. But now, faced with the consequences, he felt an unfamiliar discomfort gnawing at him. As the silence stretched on, one of the other bikers, Ryan, stepped forward. His voice was quiet but steady. "You know, Jackson, maybe he's right. We've all done stuff we're not proud of, but that doesn't mean we can't do better." The others nodded hesitantly, emboldened by Ryan's words. For the first time, Jackson saw the cracks in his control over the group. The respect he had taken for granted wasn't as solid as he thought. His chest tightened, the realization hitting him harder than any of Marcus's reprimands. Marcus, sensing the shift, placed a hand on Jackson's shoulder. His grip was firm but not unkind. "This is your chance, Jackson," Marcus said, his voice low but resolute. "You can keep running from your mistakes, or you can face them head-on. It's up to you." Jackson shrugged off Marcus's hand, his frustration boiling over. "Fine," he said sharply. "What do you want me to do, huh? Start volunteering at an animal shelter? Adopt stray dogs?" His sarcasm earned a few nervous chuckles from the group, but Marcus's stern look quickly silenced them. Keanu took a step closer, his tone calm but unyielding. Start by checking on Charlie. He's still at the vet, recovering from what you did. Look him in the eye and tell him you're sorry. Jackson's face hardened, but he didn't argue. There was a quiet inevitability in Keanu's words, as if this was something Jackson couldn't avoid any longer. "All right," he muttered. "I'll go." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Good, and we'll go with you to make sure you follow through." The group exchanged uncertain glances, but no one objected. It was clear that this wasn't just about Jackson anymore. It was about the entire group taking a hard look at their own behavior. They had stood by and let Jackson's actions go unchecked for too long, and now they had a chance to make amends. As they prepared to leave, Keanu lingered near the garage's entrance, his mind racing with thoughts of Charlie. He had seen firsthand how cruelty could break even the kindest spirits, and he wouldn't let that happen to his beloved dog. But beneath his calm exterior, a quiet unease gnawed at him. Jackson's apology, though a step in the right direction, felt incomplete. The deeper question of whether Jackson could truly change remained unanswered. The group mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life as they followed Keanu's car toward the veterinary clinic. The ride was tense, the usual camaraderie replaced by a heavy silence. Jackson rode at the front, his expression unreadable as he grappled with the weight of what lay ahead. Behind him, the others exchanged nervous glances, that unease growing with every mile. When they arrived at the clinic, Keanu led the way inside, his heart pounding as he approached the reception desk. The vet, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, greeted him with a warm smile. "Charlie's doing well," she said. "He's still a little shaken, but he's strong. He'll pull through." Keanu exhaled in relief, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He turned to Jackson, who stood a few steps behind him, his arms crossed defensively. "He's in the back," Keanu said. "Let's go." Jackson hesitated, his bravado faltering as he followed Keanu into the treatment area. The room was quiet, the air filled with the faint hum of medical equipment. Charlie lay on a soft blanket, his bandaged leg propped up on a small cushion. His eyes brightened when he saw Keanu, a faint wag of his tail betraying his happiness despite his injuries. Keanu knelt beside Charlie, gently stroking his fur. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. "You're so brave. We're going to get you through this." Jackson stood at the edge of the room, his fists clenched at his sides. Seeing the dog up close, vulnerable and trusting despite everything, made something shift inside him. For the first time, he felt a flicker of regret, not just because he had been caught, but because he had caused real harm. Keanu looked up, his gaze steady. "He's waiting for you, Jackson. Go ahead." Jackson swallowed hard, his throat dry as he stepped forward. He crouched down, his movements stiff and awkward, as if he didn't quite know how to act in this unfamiliar situation. I'm sorry, Charlie," he said quietly. His voice wavered, but there was a sincerity in it that hadn't been there before. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I was being stupid." Charlie tilted his head, his eyes locking onto Jackson's. For a moment, the room was still, the tension hanging thick in the air. Jackson stared into Charlie's eyes, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. For the first time, he felt a connection, as if the dog somehow understood the depth of his words better than anyone else could. Charlie's tail wagged faintly, a subtle but powerful response that stirred something Jackson hadn't felt in years. Guilt, yes, but also a glimmer of hope. It was a moment that could have been a turning point, but then the door to the treatment room creaked open. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was tall and imposing, with sharp features and an air of authority that made everyone in the room stand a little straighter. The vet glanced up, her smile fading as she recognized him. "Mr. Drake," she said cautiously. "I wasn't expecting you." Keanu's expression darkened slightly as he stood, instinctively placing a protective hand on Charlie. Jackson looked from Keanu to the man, confusion flickering across his face. "Who's this?" he asked, his voice low. Mr. Drake didn't bother with introductions. His cold, piercing eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Jackson before settling on Keanu. "I've heard about what happened," he said, his tone clipped, "and I'm here to make sure it doesn't escalate any further." The tension in the room thickened as Keanu's jaw tightened. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. Drake took a step closer, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in ensuring certain incidents don't attract unwanted attention. The last thing this town needs is a scandal involving one of its most prominent figures." His gaze flicked briefly to Jackson, then back to Keanu. "You understand, I'm sure." Keanu's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about avoiding attention, it's about accountability. If you're here to protect someone who doesn't deserve it, you're wasting your time." Drake's lips curled into a thin smile. "I'm here to protect the bigger picture, Mr. Reeves. And I suggest you think carefully about your next move. People are watching." The cryptic warning sent a ripple of unease through the room. Jackson shifted uncomfortably, his bravado from earlier completely evaporated. He had no idea who this man was, but the tension between him and Keanu was impossible to ignore. Before anyone could respond, Drake turned on his heel and strode toward the door. He paused just long enough to deliver one final remark. "You've made your point clear, but don't push this any further. Some things are better left in the past." With that, he was gone, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Keanu's fists clenched at his sides, his mind racing. He had dealt with men like Drake before, people who use their power and influence to bend the truth and bury consequences. But this wasn't something he could let go. Not when it involved Charlie, and not when it risked emboldening someone like Jackson. "What the hell was that about?" Jackson finally asked, his voice tinged with both anger and confusion. Keanu turned to him, his expression unreadable. "That was someone trying to protect their own interests, no matter the cost. And if you know what's good for you, you won't let him dictate your choices." Jackson opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the vet stepped forward, her brow furrowed. "Keanu," she said quietly, her voice filled with concern, "there's something you should know. Charlie's injuries, they're worse than I initially thought." The words hit Keanu like a blow, his breath catching in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The vet hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver the news. "We did some additional tests after he was brought in. His leg, there's significant nerve damage. We're doing everything we can, but there's a chance he may never walk properly again." Keanu's heart sank as he looked down at Charlie, who wagged his tail weakly as if sensing his distress. The idea of his loyal companion suffering because of someone's thoughtless cruelty filled him with a quiet, simmering rage. Jackson, standing off to the side, felt a cold knot of dread settle in his stomach. He hadn't meant to cause this much harm, he hadn't thought at all, and now the weight of his actions was becoming impossible to ignore. "I'll pay for it," Jackson blurted out, the words surprising even himself. "Whatever the treatment costs, I'll cover it." Keanu looked at him, his expression hard to read. "It's not about the money," he said evenly. "It's about what you're willing to do to make things right. Throwing money at a problem doesn't fix it." The words stung, but Jackson knew they were true. He had spent so much of his life avoiding responsibility, using his reputation and bravado to mask his insecurities. But now, standing in this room with the consequences of his actions laid bare, he felt something shift. He didn't know what to say, so he stayed silent, his mind racing. As the minutes ticked by, Keanu's thoughts turned to Drake's cryptic warning. There was more to this situation than met the eye, and he wasn't about to let it slide. He knelt beside Charlie, his voice soft but resolute. "We'll get through this, buddy, I promise." Jackson watched the quiet exchange, a gnawing sense of unease growing in his chest. For the first time, he realized that the road to redemption wouldn't just be about apologizing. It would require him to confront parts of himself he had spent years avoiding. And as he looked at Keanu and Charlie, He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Keanu didn't waste any time after leaving the clinic. He knew there was more to Mr. Drake's interference than he had let on, and something about his demeanor didn't sit right. It wasn't just about Jackson's reckless actions or the pain inflicted on Charlie. It felt bigger, like a tangled web that needed unraveling. He made a call to a trusted contact, a private investigator who specialized in uncovering the kind of secrets people like Drake worked hard to keep buried. Jackson, on the other hand, was left standing in the clinic parking lot, staring at his bike. For the first time in years, the sight of it didn't give him the usual rush of adrenaline. Instead, it reminded him of the sound of Charlie's pained yelp. His stomach churned at the thought. He had messed up, and badly. But now, instead of running away or brushing it off, he felt a pull to do something, anything to make amends. The next day, Jackson showed up at Keanu's home unannounced, holding a folder filled with adoption papers. "I know it's not enough," he said awkwardly when Keanu opened the door, "but I thought I'd start here. I went to the shelter where Charlie came from. I talked to the staff. They told me how many other animals need homes." He shifted nervously, unsure how Keanu would react. "I'm adopting one. I'm taking responsibility." Keanu stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Jackson's surprise, he stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. Jackson followed hesitantly, his eyes scanning the modest but warm interior. Charlie was lying on a plush doll bed in the corner, his leg bandaged but his eyes bright with recognition. He wagged his tail when he saw Jackson, a small but significant gesture that softened the tension in the room. "I appreciate the gesture," Keanu said finally, his voice measured. "But this isn't just about adopting a dog or paying for treatment. It's about understanding the responsibility you carry for your actions. It's about making sure this never happens again, to Charlie or anyone else." Jackson nodded, swallowing hard. "I get that, or at least I'm trying to. I can't change what I did, but I want to do better. I need to." Before Keanu could respond, his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was his investigator. He answered quickly, his tone sharp. "What did you find?" Jackson stood awkwardly in the background, unsure whether to stay or leave. But as Keanu's face darkened, his curiosity got the better of him. Keanu hung up the phone and turned to Jackson, his expression grim. "Drake isn't just some random meddler," he said. "He's tied to a network of underground activities, illegal animal fights, smuggling, exploitation. Charlie's not just any dog. He's a survivor of one of their operations." The revelation hit Jackson like a ton of bricks. Suddenly, his actions felt even heavier, and his connection to the situation deeper. "You're saying they were using him for fights?" he asked, horrified. Keanu nodded. He escaped, but not before suffering the kind of abuse that leaves scars, physical and emotional. That's why this matters. People like Drake thrive on silence and fear. They don't want anyone looking too closely at what they're doing. Jackson felt a surge of anger and determination. "Then let's make noise," he said firmly. "Let's expose them." Keanu studied him for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but this won't be easy. You need to understand what you're getting into." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Keanu and Jackson worked together, gathering evidence, reaching out to animal rights organizations, and building a case against Drake. Jackson threw himself into the effort, fueled by a newfound sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something meaningful. The climax came during a charity event hosted by Drake, an elaborate affair meant to showcase his philanthropic side. Keanu and Jackson attended, armed with evidence and allies who had infiltrated the event. As Drake took the stage to deliver a speech, Keanu stepped forward, his voice cutting through the crowd. "Mr. Drake," he said loudly, "why don't you tell everyone the truth about where your funding really comes from?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the confrontation. Drake's confident facade faltered as Keanu produced a folder of documents, photographs, and testimonies. The audience murmured in shock as the evidence was projected onto a screen, revealing the extent of Drake's illegal activities. Drake tried to deny it, but the tide had already turned. Security personnel stepped in, and within minutes, law enforcement arrived, having been tipped off earlier by Keanu's team. As Drake was led away in handcuffs, Jackson felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he had done something that truly mattered. But just as he allowed himself a moment of relief, Keanu turned to him with a serious expression. "There's still one more thing," he said. Jackson frowned. "What do you mean?" Keanu gestured to the screen, where an image of another dog, a scared but hopeful-looking pit bull, flickered into view. There are others out there, still trapped in that world. Rescuing Charlie was just the beginning. If you're serious about making amends, it's time to step up. Jackson nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm in," he said simply. The two men exchanged a look of mutual understanding, that unlikely partnership forged in the heat of conflict but tempered by a shared goal. As they walked out of the event together, Charlie limping happily at Keanu's side, Jackson couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where he could finally make a difference. In the days that followed Drake's arrest, the story quickly became national news. The revelations about his illegal activities sparked outrage, and the community rallied to support the animals that had been victims of his cruelty. Keanu and Jackson found themselves at the center of the effort, working tirelessly to ensure that justice wasn't just served, but that real change would come from everything that had happened. For Keanu, it was a deeply personal mission. Charlie's journey from a victim to a survivor had always been a symbol of hope for him, and now it had inspired an entire movement. He threw himself into coordinating with animal rescue organizations, using his influence to push for stronger laws against animal cruelty. Charlie became a kind of ambassador for the cause, his gentle nature and resilient spirit touching the hearts of everyone who met him. Jackson, meanwhile, found himself on a path he never could have imagined. At first, he felt out of place in the world of advocacy and rescue work, but the more he learned, the more passionate he became. He started volunteering at shelters, helping to rehabilitate animals that had suffered similar fates to Charlie's. It was hard work, but for the first time in his life, Jackson felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. He also kept his promise to adopt a dog. The shelter staff helped him choose a pit bull named Max, a sweet-natured but timid dog who had been overlooked by potential adopters. Max reminded Jackson of Charlie in some ways, hesitant and wary at first, but full of potential. Slowly, they built trust, and the bond that grew between them became a source of healing for both. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of their efforts became increasingly visible. More animals were rescued from Drake's operations, and the public's support led to significant donations for shelters and rescue organizations. Laws began to change, with stricter penalties for animal cruelty being introduced at both state and national levels. Keanu and Jackson worked together to keep the momentum going, that unlikely partnership turning into a genuine friendship. One evening, as they sat on Keanu's porch with Charlie and Max lunging at their feet, Jackson broke the comfortable silence. "You know," he said, "I used to think people couldn't really change. That who you are is set in stone." Keanu looked at him thoughtfully. "And now?" Jackson smiled, scratching behind Max's ears. "Now I think I was wrong. Change is hard, but it's possible. You just have to want it bad enough." Keanu nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's not about being perfect," he said. "It's about trying. Owning up to your mistakes and doing better. That's all anyone can ask for." They sat in silence for a while longer, the sound of crickets filling the air. Jackson felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He thought back to the moment he had kicked Charlie, the anger and recklessness that had driven him, and how far he had come since then. It wasn't something he could undo, but he had learned to take responsibility, to grow from it. And in doing so, he had found a purpose he never thought he'd have. The final twist came weeks later, when Jackson received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from one of the organizations they had partnered with, informing him that Max wasn't just any dog, he was Charlie's brother. The shelter had discovered the connection while reviewing records from Drake's operation. Jackson stared at the letter in disbelief, his mind racing. He thought back to the way Max had seemed to instinctively trust Charlie the first time they met, the way they played together like old friends. It all made sense now. Jackson brought the letter to Keanu, who read it with a quiet smile. "Guess it was meant to be," Keanu said, looking at Max and Charlie, who were curled up together on the floor. They found each other again, just like we all did, in a way. The revelation added another layer of meaning to everything they had been through. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a chance for connection, for redemption, for hope. It wasn't the ending Jackson had expected when he first walked into that clinic, but it was one he wouldn't trade for anything. As the months turned into a year, the ripple effects of their actions continued to spread. Jackson became a dedicated advocate for animal welfare, using his story to inspire others to take responsibility and make a difference. Keanu continued to be a driving force in the movement, his quiet determination and unwavering commitment earning him the respect of everyone who worked alongside him. Charlie and Max thrived in their new lives, their bond unshakable. They became symbols of resilience and love, reminders of what could be achieved when people came together to do what was right. The story of the ruthless biker who kicked a dog for fun and the compassionate man who gave that dog a second chance became more than just a cautionary tale. It became a testament to the power of change, the importance of accountability, and the idea that even the most unlikely individuals could make a difference when they chose to. In the end, it wasn't about Keanu or Jackson or even Charlie and Max. It was about the countless lives that had been touched, the small but significant ways the world had been made better because of their actions. It was a story of redemption, not just for Jackson, but for everyone who had ever felt lost and found their way again. And as they moved forward, they carried that lesson with them, a reminder that no matter how broken things seemed, there was always a chance to make them whole again.